On Monday morning, the world woke up to an image it was never supposed to see. A sitting president, in handcuffs, stepping off a helicopter in New York City. I'm Kaitlan Collins. And this wasn't just an arrest, it was a rupture. Because when Nicolas Maduro was pulled out of Venezuela under cover of darkness and brought to a US courtroom, something far bigger than one man was put on trial: power, sovereignty. The rules that claim to govern nations, the Trump administration calls it justice, a law enforcement action, a president accused of narco-terrorism finally facing consequences. But legal experts are calling it something else entirely. A violation, a dangerous precedent. And here's the question you should be asking yourself right now. If the United States can seize a foreign president by force, what rules still protect anyone else? If that question unsettles you, stay with me. And if you want clarity in moments like this, follow along, because what comes next only gets more complicated. Now, let's break this down calmly. What exactly does the United States say it did? Before we go any further, we need to be precise about what this case actually is and what it is not. This is not a war. At least, that's what the United States insists. The Trump administration says Nicolas Maduro was brought to New York to face long-standing criminal charges. Drug trafficking, narco-terrorism, allegations that his government enabled the flow of massive quantities of cocaine into the United States. In their telling, this was a law enforcement operation tied to an existing indictment, nothing more. But here's where the problem begins. Maduro was not extradited. There was no public approval from Venezuela, and there was no authorization from the United Nations. Instead, US forces entered another country and removed its sitting president by force. That single fact forces two legal systems into direct conflict. International law, which restricts the use of force between states, and US domestic law, which often allows courts to proceed regardless of how a defendant arrives on American soil. So the real issue isn't just whether Maduro is guilty, it's whether the process itself shattered rules designed to restrain power. To understand how we reached this moment, we have to go back and look at the foundations beneath it. To understand how this became possible, you have to zoom out beyond this moment, beyond this administration. For years, Nicolas Maduro has been a target of international condemnation. In 2020, United Nations investigators accused his government of egregious violations amounting to crimes against humanity, implicating Maduro and senior officials. Around the same time, the United States formally indicted him on drug trafficking charges, accusing his government of enabling vast cocaine flows toward American shores. But here's the critical backdrop. Despite those accusations, Maduro remained a sitting president. And under international law, that status matters. The UN Charter, written in the aftermath of global war, places strict limits on when one country can use force against another. Military action is only justified in self-defense against an imminent armed attack, or with explicit approval from the UN Security Council. Drug trafficking, even at massive scale, is treated as a law enforcement issue, not an act of war. For decades, that distinction held. Accusations did not equal invasion. Indictments did not override sovereignty. Until now. Because once those boundaries blur, the system itself begins to bend, and that bending sets the stage for crisis. The first real rupture came not with words, but with action. Under cover of darkness, a US operation entered Venezuela. No public extradition request, no international mandate. Nicolas Maduro was removed from his country and put on a plane bound for New York. By the time the sun rose, he was no longer a head of state on Venezuelan soil. He was a defendant in a US courtroom. Attorney General Pam Bondi called it justice. She said the mission was carried out professionally, lawfully, and in support of an ongoing criminal prosecution tied to large-scale narcotics trafficking. Secretary of State Marco Rubio described it as a law enforcement function, not an act of war. But the moment that helicopter landed, the legal shockwaves began. International law experts immediately raised alarms. Because conducting a military-style operation inside another sovereign nation without consent, without UN approval, cuts directly against the core principle of the UN Charter. This wasn't just about Maduro anymore. It was about precedent. If this is law enforcement, where does force begin? And if this is force, who decides when it's allowed? If you're trying to make sense of this, stay with me. Because the most important part of this story is what was never said out loud. And that's where the real mechanism comes into view. What the administration avoided saying outright is what matters most. Because this case only works if you accept a quiet redefinition of power. Publicly, U.S. officials framed the operation as law enforcement, a technical step to enforce an existing indictment, a mission to support the courts. That language matters because under international law, police action and military action live in different worlds. But here's the mechanism beneath the surface. Law enforcement normally requires cooperation, extradition, consent, process. Force does not. By calling this law enforcement while executing it with military precision, the United States threaded a narrow legal needle. It avoided calling the operation an act of war, while still using power that looks indistinguishable from one. Experts point out the contradiction. International law does not allow one country to enter another and arrest its leader unilaterally. Drug trafficking, even on a massive scale, does not qualify as an armed attack. And without UN Security Council approval, the legal justification collapses. Yet domestically, the calculus shifts. U.S. courts have long held that how a defendant arrives on American soil does not prevent a trial from moving forward. Once jurisdiction is established, the case proceeds. That gap between international rules and domestic enforcement is the real engine here. And once you see it, the next escalation becomes almost inevitable. The second crisis hits when the legal fallout collides with political reality. Maduro's lawyers move fast. In a Manhattan courtroom, they challenge the very act that brought him there. They argue the United States violated international law, that a sovereign president was abducted, that the case itself is poisoned by how it began. It sounds explosive. But inside the US legal system, it's not new. There is deep precedent here. Courts have repeatedly ruled that even if a defendant is kidnapped, abducted, or forcibly brought to the United States, that alone is not grounds to dismiss the charges. Jurisdiction, once established, tends to stick. And that's the second rupture. Because while international law may have been broken, US federal courts are likely to proceed as if none of that matters. The judge can acknowledge the controversy and still move the case forward. Now add another layer. The president ordered a cross-border operation without notifying Congress in advance. The War Powers Resolution says Congress should be consulted in every possible instance. The administration says advance notice would have endangered the mission. This is where everything tightens. A president testing the outer limits of force, courts likely to look away, and a system designed to restrain power, quietly absorbing the shock. At this point, the question stops being legal and starts becoming human. And this is where it lands on you. Because when power shifts at the top, it never stays there. If you're watching this from your phone, your couch, your commute, it might feel distant. A foreign president, a courtroom in New York, big names, big law. But the mechanism being tested here doesn't stop at borders. If a government can decide that process is optional when the stakes feel high enough, that logic doesn't disappear. It travels, it normalizes, it lowers the bar. You're told this is about drugs, about crime, about keeping people safe. But you're also watching a system say the ends can justify the means even when international rules are bent or ignored. And once that idea takes hold, accountability becomes selective. Some people are protected by law, others are subject to power. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting beneath this case. If this makes you uneasy, it should. Because history shows that when legal gray zones expand, ordinary people feel the consequences long before leaders do. If you want to understand how these decisions ripple outward and why they don't stay contained, stay with me. Because beyond this courtroom, the impact doesn't stop at the United States. What happened here doesn't exist in a vacuum. The moment this operation became public, it sent a signal far beyond Caracas or New York. Other governments are watching closely. Allies, rivals, neutral states. Because if the United States, the country that helped write the post-war international order, is willing to bypass sovereignty when it sees fit, that reshapes expectations everywhere. International law only works when powerful countries choose to respect it. Once exceptions become normalized, weaker states lose their shield, and stronger ones gain a precedent they can cite when it suits them. Imagine how this plays in Moscow, in Beijing, in capitals where leaders already argue that Western rules are selective, flexible, and politically convenient. This case hands them an argument that force can be framed as law enforcement, and borders can be crossed in the name of justice. That's the geopolitical ripple. Trust erodes, norms weaken, and cooperation gives way to suspicion. Drug trafficking, human rights abuses, political crimes, all of these require international coordination to confront. But coordination depends on consent, not coercion. Once that balance breaks, enforcement turns into confrontation. And when confrontation becomes the default, the future stops being theoretical. It becomes urgent. What comes next depends on which path the system chooses to take. And there are really only three. In the first scenario, the most optimistic one, this case becomes an exception. Courts proceed, Maduro stands trial. But the backlash is strong enough that future administrations pull back. International pressure forces clearer limits. Extradition, cooperation, consent, those rules are reinforced, not discarded. The system bends, but it does not break. In the second scenario, the middle ground, ambiguity becomes policy. The legal gray zone remains unresolved. The United States neither fully defends nor fully disavows what it did. Other countries test similar tactics, not constantly, but selectively. Power is used quietly, case by case. The rules still exist, but only on paper. And then there's the third scenario, the dangerous one. Force, rebranded as law enforcement, becomes normalized. Sovereignty becomes conditional. Leaders justify cross-border seizures by pointing to this moment. International law loses its deterrent power, not in one collapse, but through repetition. History tells us systems rarely fail all at once. They erode, and the direction they take is shaped not just by leaders, but by what the world accepts in moments like this. Which brings us to the real ending. Because this story isn't actually about Nicolas Maduro. It's about what happens when power moves faster than the rules meant to restrain it. The Trump administration insists this was justice, and US courts may agree, at least procedurally. Maduro will likely face trial, regardless of how he arrived. But legality and legitimacy are not the same thing. When the world sees a president seized by force and told the process doesn't matter, something fundamental shifts. Trust weakens, norms blur, and the line between enforcement and domination grows thinner. You and I don't get to decide the verdict in that courtroom, but we do get to decide what we accept as normal. Because once extraordinary actions stop shocking us, they stop being extraordinary. If you want to keep understanding how power, law, and accountability collide, follow this conversation. Share it. Question it. This isn't the end of the story. It's the warning shot.